So we continue in our study of Sefer Yirmiyahu. We should point out for the record that today is Tisha Asar Yomim LaOmer Dalid B'Iyar Toshim Pe'eh, corresponding to the 2nd of May 2025. Liminyan HaTo'im. And I think we got up to Pasuk Yod Zayin, the first perek of Yirmiyahu. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yes. Very good. Okay, so Pasuk Tet Zayin is over here. So this now comes on the heels of the previous Pesukim, obviously. The last couple of Pesukim were, let us read from Pasuk Tet well. Ki hineni kore lechol mishpachot mamlechot sofona nom Adonai. All the coalition of all these northern kingdoms under the leadership of Bavel. ובאו ונתנו איש כסאו פתח שערי ירושלים ועל כל חומותיה סביב ועל כל ערי יהודה. So they shall invade the country, they will invade Eretz Yehuda, and they will come up to the wall of Yerushalayim. ודיברתי משפטי אותם על כל רעתם, and I shall make known my displeasure and judge them for what they have done. What is their evil? Asher azavuni, that they turn their backs on. ويكتروا لإلهim אחרים ويشتهوا למעשה ידיהם. So Avodah Zarah is clearly the central thing that is pointed out here in this pasuk, and as we shall see time and time again. Pasuk Yod Zayin, Wa'ata, and therefore now you, ta'zor mufnecha, literally gird your loins. V'kamta, v'dibarta alehem, et kol asher anochi asawaka, al tehath mipenehem, pen ahitecha lifnehem. Rise up and speak to them and say to them and chastise them according to that which I will instruct you. Al tehath mipnehem, do not fear them. Pen ahitecha lifnehem, lest I cause you to fall before them. Let us see what Targum Yonathan here says over here. Wa'at tethakaf harsach, gird your loins. Uthkum, rise up. V'titnabeh lahom, and prophecy to them. In other words, speak to them, as the pasuk said. V'dibarta alehem. Yonathan translates v'titnabeh lashon nevuah, because that which you will speak will be from me, nevuah. Yath kol da'ana mefaked lach, all that I command you. La titmena mila ocha huthahon, do not refrain from chastising them. Lochiach mila ocha huthahon, dilma eth berinach kadamehon, lest I break you, crush you in front of them. In other words, if you will refuse to carry out my wishes and my command to you to speak to them and to chastise them. And in Pasuk, I didn't use the word lochiach. It said, al tehath mipanehem, do not literally fear, but do not be fearful of them. The Targum of Yonathan is more instructive. It says, La tithmena mila ocha huthahon, do not refrain from chastising them. In other words, telling them the truth. Why would you refrain from telling them the truth? Because you're scared of them, what they might do to you. So Hashem says to Yirmiyahu, I'm giving you a fairly difficult task, that is true, and you must not fear them. You must not hold back. What Hashem is saying to Yirmiyahu is, do not hold back. La titmena mila ocha huthahon. Dilma eth berinach is I shall break you, right? The tau and the shin interchange between Aramit and Lashon HaKodesh, lest I break you before them. In other words, if you do not carry out my will, then I will allow them to have their way with you. Next pasuk. Wa'ani hine netaticha hayom la'ir midthar ul'amud barzal. I'm making you this day a strong walled city that cannot be conquered or overrun. Ul'amud barzal, and like a pillar of iron. Ul'hamoth nahoshet al kol haaretz, and as if you will be surrounded, as it were, by walls of copper or metal. In other words, you will go ahead and do that which I instruct you, and it will not be easy. They will not like what they hear from you, and they're likely to try and harm you in various ways. And Yirmiyahu obviously understood this as well, and Hashem is telling him that I am sending you on this difficult, arduous, and dangerous mission, because it is directed at whom? لَمَلْخَيْ يُوذَا لِلصَّرَاهَا لِخَوْهَنَا وَلَعَنْهَا أَرَسْ. It is directed at the kings of Yehuda and the well, Saraha means the various ministers and various officials of the king who run the country. The Kohanea and the Kohanim, who are also a powerful group. Ul'anha ares, and the people, the common people. And because they will not like what they hear, you will be made aware of the fact that you're not very popular. In other words, Yirmiyahu is actually being told here that you're going to have a difficult life. That's basically, and he's a young man here at this point. How old is he? Really, we don't know exactly, but I would be guessing something like maybe 16, 17, 18 at the most, something like that. What does Targum Yonatan say in Pasuk Yod Het? Wa'ana ha yahavtach Yoma, then I have made you, I have placed you, established you, takif kirya, strong and powerful and indomitable, like a kirya kericha, which means a walled city. As I said in the Pasuk, the Yirmiyahu, right? That's where the word Karach comes from. You've heard the word Karach. Karach is a big city, a large city, with a Shon Chazal. So you see here, Kirya Kericha, like a large walled city that cannot be conquered. Amud devarzel, as we said before, the same, that's literal. Uchshur din hashan, like a wall of copper. Lashka'a chas dilawat, to literally pour out cups of curse and evil, l'chol yathavei ara'ah, to all the inhabitants of the land, namely l'malchaya, the kings, the Beth Yehuda, of the house of Yehuda, that is to say, Beth David, the Ravaha, to the leaders, the officers, the ministers of government, l'chanaha, the Kohanim of the city of Yerushalayim, ul'ana da'ara, and the common people. My understanding is when Hashem says to Yirmiyahu in Pasuk Yod Zayin, V'ata tazom ofnecha v'kamta v'dibarta alehem. What does that mean, to go up? Go up where? I assume it means to go up to Yerushalayim. As we mentioned, he lived in Anathoth, which is 3-4 kilometers from Yeratika. So he's being told to go on a small journey, because that's where the seat of government is, that's where the people are. And Anathoth was a small place, relatively speaking, and he was being directed to speak to the leadership, first of all, and to the people of Yerushalayim, because Yerushalayim was the most important, the central and most influential place in Mamlechet Yehuda, obviously. And they will not like what they hear, what you have to say. As the Pasuk says, Pasuk Yotet, Unilhamu elecha, they will fight against you. But they will not be able to overcome you. In other words, Hashem is also promising, yes, you will not have it easy, but I will not allow them to destroy you. They shall fight against you, but they will not be able to overcome you. Because I am with you. I am with you. I will be with you to protect you. The Targum states, "Uyahon dayanin umrihin lekivlach." They will confront you. Mechihin, I would say, means to confront, really. Usually the word, this word in Aramaic is mentioned in connection with battle. In other words, they will come against you in battle. They will come against you to do war against you. But here the word krav is not mentioned. It just says mechihin. And dayanin means they will judge you. They will have ta'anuf against you. In order to contradict, to negate the words of your prophecy, that they will not be able to overcome you. Because my word, in other words, my hashgacha will be with you to save you from their hands and to facilitate this job that I am sending you on. Perek Bet, Perek Sheni. Waihi, Devar Adonai Elai, Lemor. So Yirmiyahu reports that Hashem spoke to him. And previously in Pasuk Yud Gimel, we saw that said, Waihi Devar Adonai Elai Shenith Lemor. So this would be the third time it would appear that Hashem spoke to him. Haloch, V'karatha v'oznei Yerushalayim Lemor. Go, and again, when it says go, I understand it means go up to Yerushalayim, because he wasn't a resident of Yerushalayim. V'karatha v'oznei Yerushalayim, and call in the ears of Yerushalayim, in other words, of the inhabitants, all the inhabitants, the ones that were mentioned above. Haloch v'karatha v'oznei Yerushalayim Lemor. Haloch v'karatha v'oznei Yerushalayim Lemor. Go and cry out. In other words, in a loud voice. In other words, announce. So just to speak is to announce to all of Yerushalayim. Ka amar Adonai. Thus says Hashem. Zacharti lach hased ne'orayich. I recall your behavior, hased ne'orayich, when you were younger. In other words, when I took you out of Mitzrayim, when Am Yisrael was born, so to speak. Ahavat karulotayich. Your love towards me and your behavior towards me, at the time of your wedding, when we were wed, so to speak. Hashem is constantly referring to himself. Well, the Navi refers to Hashem as the Hathan and Yerushalayim as the Kala. Am Yisrael as the Kala. Lechtecha harai b'midbar, you followed me in the wilderness, ba'areth lo zerua. A barren land which cannot be sown, which cannot be, where a person cannot grow anything. So it says here in the Targum, that's straightforward. Go and prophesy, in other words, call out, speak, announce to the people of Yerushalayim, saying as follows, Kidnan Amar Adonai. This is what Hashem states. Dechirna lechon, I remember, I recall, Tavuaf Yomei Kedam, your good deeds of the past, of the early times, early years. Rahamath Avathachon, the love of your forefathers, Dehemino v'memori, who trusted in my word, Wa'azalu Bathar Teren Shelihai, and they were followed by two messengers. Rathar Moshe wa Aharon. They followed Moshe and Aharon b'madbara in the desert. We also know there were many who complained, as we recall. But the fact is, Am Yisrael did follow Moshe and Aharon into the desert and throughout the years of the Midbar, Arba'in Shanin, 40 years, below Zawadin, without supplies, Ba'ara lam mizdar'a, in a land which cannot be cultivated. In other words, a barren land. In other words, the fact that Am Yisrael followed Moshe and Aharon in the desert, that is a nisayon gadol. That is not a simple thing. We also know that Am Yisrael did not always accept this nisayon in the correct and appropriate manner. But the fact is, if you ignore the particular, more specific events here and there, and you look at the big picture is that Am Yisrael followed Hashem into the desert. That was a test of faith. And Hashem says here, I recall these things. Why do I recall these things? Because we're about to hear what Hashem is about to bring upon Am Yisrael. So he says, even though this is what I am about to do, nevertheless, I remember who you are, who you were, what you did, how your forefathers followed me, believed in me. And therefore, the next pasuk says, this is how Hashem views Am Yisrael, even when they're Risha'im, and even when they're worshipping Avodah Zarah, Hashem, nevertheless, the basic attitude towards the Jewish people is as follows. Kodesh Yisrael Adonai. Am Yisrael is Kodesh L'Hashem. Kodesh L'Hashem means that special, set aside, unique, set aside by Hashem for His purposes. Reshith Tevuato, the beginning of the beginning of the harvest, which is a reference, as we will see, to the teruma, which is a special status, when the teruma, which is taken from the harvest. Kol ochalo yeshamu, all those who literally eat him or harm him will be found guilty. Ra'at tavo alehem Nomadunai, and evil will come upon them, says Hashem. In other words, yes, I'm going to punish you. You're about to receive my punishment at the hand of these various peoples, but they too will be found guilty for what they have done. So it says in Pasuk Gimel in the Targum, Kudsha inun bet Yisrael. Am Yisrael, bet Yisrael, as it says here, are Kudsha, Kodesh, in other words, sacrosanct, set aside, special. And as for those who do evil against them, those who are bozezotam, mithashavin, kedema aramut arola, that they will be considered like those who eat from the teruma when they're not entitled to do so. In other words, only kohanim may eat from the teruma. Anyone else eats from the teruma is considered it's a very serious avera. Zar shochel teruma can be punished by mitabi de shamayim. So it's a very serious thing. They will be considered like someone who ate dema ramuth alala. These words mean the dema basically is like the word teruma. We have in the Mishnah in Masechet Terumot, we have the concept of dimua, which is the same idea here. In other words, that which is teruma, which then has a special status, aramuth alala, that which is removed from the tevuah, from the crop. Demand achel mina, he who eats of it, and is not entitled to do so, hayav limamath, as we said a moment ago, is guilty of it's a capital offense. Also, hasad omer aramutha, and also they are considered, Am Yisrael are like the omer, the big, which is taken at the beginning. Sheru hasad, sheru is beginning, hasad is the harvest, the act of harvesting. So the first the first part of the wheat harvest begins with the Tenufat Ha'omer on Tetzain Ben Nisan. Aramutha, which is raised up. Until the Kohanim B'nei Aaron bring a korban from this newly harvested wheat, from this year's crop. Until they do not bring Kohanaya B'nei Aaron Kurbana Al Madbeha, they do not bring to the Mizbeach the Minchat HaOmer. Kol da'achel mineh, anyone who eats of the new crop, mit hayav, is hayav. Again, hayav mitah. Af ken kol bazazehon davet Yisrael yechovun bishta. In the same way, all those who harm Am Yisrael, even though they're doing my will, on the one hand, on the other hand, anyone who touches Am Yisrael, yechovun bishta, they will be found guilty and they will be punished. I'm sorry. Af ken kol bozazehon davet Yisrael yechovun, comma, all those who attack, who harm Am Yisrael will be found guilty. Bishta tefeh alehon, evil will come upon them. To look at Rashi here for a moment. Rashi says here in Pesach Beth, Zachalti lach, in other words, im hayitem shavim yonai, were you to do teshuvah and return to me, ta'awathi l'rachem alechem, it is my real desire, my true desire is to be merciful towards you and forgive you if you were to do teshuvah. Why? Ki zachalti lach hesed nuraich, v'avav kalilath upotech. I remember how you were, your relationship with me in earlier times, like that of a Hatan and a Kara, when I brought you into the chuppah, which is by way of Yitziat Mitzrayim and Matan Torah, and entering Eretz Yisrael. That's the chuppah, as it were. V'lashon hachnasahu. In other words, this word means, when the pasuk states kelulotayich, it really means to enter into the marriage contract, as it were. Kelulotayich. He brings a French word. It's interesting. I don't know what that word means in ancient French, but I have a book that will explain it to us. I have, in fact, two books that can explain this to us. One is called Osara La'azim by Moshe Katan is his name. He has a volume like this on the Talmud, when Rashi brings words in the Talmud, in his Perush in medieval French. He translates, he brings the explanation of what each of those words means. And he also has this other volume here that I have now in front of me on Tanakh. So Rashi says, this word he brings it seems to me that it comes from the word night. It's almost like the word in Spanish, noches, right? It's in other words, the wedding night. Kalulafayich refers to the wedding itself. In other words, the connection, the joining of Am Yisrael and Hashem by way of, as we said, Yitziat Mitzrayim, Matan Torah, entering as Yisrael, being willing to go through the desert first, etc. And that's what Rashi says now. Umahu hased ne'urayich. What was this great hesed that you did when you were young? Lechtech aharai, ahar shaluhai. You followed my messengers, Moshe wa Aharon. So you can see that Rashi is taking this from the Targum that we just saw, right? He doesn't actually mention the Targum here, but it's clearly, it follows along the lines of the Targum, and also certain statements of Chazal to this effect. So Lechtech Aharai means following my messages that I sent Moshe wa Aharon. Me'eretz noshavet yisiatam lamidbar. They left a settled and very fertile land. Mitzrayim was very fertile because of the Nile, and they went into the desert. It's not something that most people are willing to do. Most people, most nations. There were no supplies for going into the desert, for staying there. Ki ha'aminu bi. But why were they willing to do this? Because they believed in me. If I said to them, do this, it'll be okay, they trusted me. And that is the hesed. That is something unusual and something special. The next pasuk, Rashi says, Kodesh Yisrael. Rashi says, Kithruma, as we explained, right? In other words, Am Yisrael is like the whole world, all of humanity is like the harvest. You have a field of wheat. But from that large field of wheat, you take a certain small section or part and separate it and dedicate it to Hashem and give it to the Kohanim. And that's the teruma, that which is literally raised up, that which is raised up and separated. Am Yisrael is like the teruma, within humanity. In some ways, this is reminiscent of what Rabbi Yehuda Levi writes in Sefer HaKozari. Am Yisrael is like the lev. Comparing the world to a human body, he says Am Yisrael is like the lev, the heart of the world. So here, and so this is not so different. It says that Am Yisrael. This is the pshat of the pasuk. This is not a drasha on the pasuk. Both what Rashi here is saying and that which Yonathan ben Uziel said, that's the pshat. Kodesh Yisrael Adonai Reshith Tevuato. It's like the special part of the harvest, which is the teruma. You will note, by the way, if you look carefully in the text before you, Reshith Tevuato. In Rashi's version, it says Tevuato with a waw at the end. See, Tevuato. And then it says in brackets Benushainu Tevuato, but it's written with a he. Right? That's not a mistake. There were quite a few differences of different spellings, and on occasion, rare occasions, even a different word. But most of the time, it's different spellings of words throughout the Tanakh, Torah, Nevim, and Ketuvim. In the early part of the Middle Ages in France, in Sarfat, where Rashi was.
Yeah.
So, and these differences are reflected in the Kitvei Yad, in the manuscript, sometimes also in the printed versions of these Perushim, and not just Rashi, others as well, like Rabbi Yosef Kara and Rabbi Yosef Bechor Shor and the Rashbam. In the early period of Rishonim in Tzorfat, we see that they had slightly different readings in the Tanakh. So that's why you see this wow and a hey, but it's the same word. Bereshith Tevuato, Kereshith Kasir Lifnei HaOmer, like the beginning of the harvest, before the Omer. She'asur ba'achila, v'ha'ochalo mithayev. It is asur to eat from the new crop, which is called Hadash, until the bringing of the Omer on Tet Zayin B'Nisan. When the halacha is that when there is no Omer, when there's no Mikdash, there's no Trumat Omer taking place, then Hayom Matir, that day is Matir, so you have to wait till the next day. But at any rate, there's an Isur that you have a crop, but you're not allowed to touch it. And that part which is Muram, like the Truma or the Omer, has a special status. So Rashi says, Reshith Tevuato, Kereshith Chesir Lifnei HaOmer. Am Yisrael is the world is like this field, and within it there's this Omer, there's a special section which has to be removed, which is Asur Ba'achila. Has to be made. It goes towards making the Minhat Omer, the Korban, made from the flour. And he who eats it, Mithayev, is guilty. Ken Kol Ochalo Yashanu. And you see, Rashi does mention Yonathan explicitly. Ken Tirgem Yonathan. Right, so he's telling you explicitly, I'm basing what I'm saying on Yonathan. Because it's really the pshat of the pasuk. But Targum Yonathan expands on the imagery in the pasuk. And Rashi follows in his footsteps. Pasuk Daled. So really, Pasuk Daled now, which is a new parasha, new section, as you can see, is where the Tochaha really begins. In other words, up until this point, this was a kind of introduction. First, there was the choosing of Yirmiyahu and preparing Yirmiyahu and informing him of what his task would be. and that he has no choice. He didn't ask for this job, but he has no choice in the matter either, which is in many ways very relevant to all of us all the time, because Am Yisrael was chosen. We didn't ask to be chosen. We were. We didn't choose the job chose us.
Yeah.
And or Hashem chose us. Just as Yirmiyahu is told, you have a difficult task ahead of you. In other words, a difficult life ahead of you. Yeah, Am Yisrael is in the same situation always. We have a difficult path before us, but as Hashem said in Pasuk Yotet I'm sorry, in Pasuk in Pasuk Yotet, the previous perek, Hashem said to him, "But they will not be able to overcome you. Ki itecha ani, I am with you, to save you." This was said to Yirmiyahu, but it's also true of Am Yisrael. The parallel is obvious. So that was all by way of introduction. And then the second part of the introduction was the beginning of this chapter, the first three Pesukim, where Hashem says that despite what's about that which is about to happen, you are still my beloved wife, and I remember how you behaved, and the relationship that we had, and therefore, whatever comes, you need to know that you will not be destroyed, and those who harm you, they will be destroyed. Pasuk Dalet, Shim'u devar Adonai bet Yaakov. Hear the word of Hashem, bet Yaakov v'chol mishpachot bet Yisrael, and all the families, literally, of bet Yisrael. What does that mean? The Targum says, Dalet, Kabilu pitganad Adonai bet Yaakov. Here, accept the words of Hashem, bet Yaakov, v'chol zar'ayat bet Yisrael, and all the families, all the children of Am Yisrael. Ka Amar Adonai. That says Hashem. Ma muthla'u avotechem bi'awel, ki rahaku me'alai. What did your forefathers find wrong or undesirable with me? What did they find? What fault did they find in me? Ki rahaku me'alai, seeing that they chose to distance themselves from me. Why was this? Vayalechu, and they went after, they followed Aharei Hever, they followed the empty nothingness. Hever literally is hot air. We'ebalu, and therefore they also became Hever. When you follow Hever, when you live according to the dictates and the concepts and the notions of Hever, which is nothingness. Maybe it makes a lot of noise, but there's nothing real there. Then you also become heaven. That's what the Pasuk Targum says here. What lie, what impropriety did they find, your forefathers, in anything that I said? They distanced themselves from fear of me. In other words, what the Pasuk said, Ki rahaku me'alai. Targum says they distanced themselves from fearing me. Uta'o, and they chose to go after, to mislead themselves, like the word ta'uth, right? Uta'o, bathar, ta'awatha, wahawala lama. They followed ta'awatha. The word ta'awatha always means avodah zarah, idolatry, etc. And therefore they became lama. In other words, shum davar. Lama is, just like nothingness. Look at Rashi. No Rashi on that pasuk. Pasuk 12. V'lo amru ayeh Adonai, and they did not say, ayeh Adonai, where is Hashem? Hamna'ale othanu maras Mitzrayim. He took us up out of Mitzrayim. Hamorich othanu b'midbar, who led us in the desert. Ba'aras arava v'shuha, ba'aras siyah v'tharmaweth, who led us in the desert, a land of, we'll explain these words more fully in a moment, but basically of empty uh, and uneven ground. Right, the word shuha is a foxhole, a pit. Ba'aretz in the land of thirst and death. Ba'aretz lo of arbaish, a land that has never been traversed by anybody. Lo of arbaish, v'lo yashav adam sham, and no one lives there. In other words, it's desert. It's desolate. Targum says, "V'lo amaru nidhal min kadam Adonai." They did not say, "Let us fear Hashem." Da'asek yathana mi'arad Misraim, who brought us up out of the land of Misraim. In other words, the previous pasuk said, they distanced themselves from me. They went after Hevel, after Avodah Zarah. And what should they have done? Instead of doing what they should have done, which is they did not say, "Where is Hashem? Let us learn about Him. Let us follow Him, who took us out of Mitzrayim. The Bar Yathana b'Madbara, He who led us in the desert. Ba'ara Meshar, a land which is Meshar means flat, like a plain. Waharuv, desolate. Ba'ara Thadiyah, a land of emptiness, desolation, and death. Ba'ar'ad la adha enosh, a land that people do not travel. Wala itothav enosha taman, and human beings do not dwell there. So instead of recalling these things and asking themselves, where were we? What did we? How did we not do this? They went out. They chose Avodah Zarah instead. Rashi on this pasuk says in pasuk wa v'lo amru Adonai ki nelech Elohim acherim, because we chose to go after follow other gods. Instead of saying, where is Hashem? How do we follow Him? Here Rashi translates, or someone, or his Talmidim added perhaps, that's why it's in brackets. We know that Rashi's Perushim not infrequently had, particularly on the Tanakh, they had certain, his Talmidim, when they copied it, they sometimes added something. So that's why it's in brackets. Arava, he brings the word in ancient French, which is the same as the word as plain, right, as you can see, right? Planura, planure, maybe in French.
Mm-hmm.
Probably was pronounced planure. Rashi transliterates the French. He has a system how he transliterates. So if there's an E at the end, for example, which is not pronounced, but he puts an aleph at the end. So it's planur, whatever. The people in his day probably understood this intuitively.
Mm.
The word shuha is, Rashi says here, natuya. What does that mean? Natuya means not flat. In other words, rugged terrain. And that's why there is a shuha. The word shuha means a pit. Something was dug out, like an infantry soldier digs a pit in the ground to protect himself, correct?
Yep.
You know about that.
A little bit.
Right. So it's an uneven, flat, uneven area. In other words, difficult to travel, to traverse. Thliya, the word thliya, which basically means desolation. Rashi brings a word in French for that, which is shemama, which means shemama, in the words desolate. And Thalmaweth, Rashi says, means Lashon Hoshecho, in other words, a place of darkness, of nothingness, of emptiness. So I, Hashem, took you into the desert, led you through all these difficult places. It was a very real test of you or your forefathers. And after that, instead of thinking about remembering these events and dwelling upon them, And what happened after that, after the desert? وَأَبِيَتْخَمْ, this is Pasuk Zayin. وَأَبِيَتْخَمْ الْأَرَثْ HaKarmel. I brought you to a beautiful, lush land. That's what the word Carmela means. The Targum says, so the Pasuk says in Pasuk Zayin, وَأَبِيَتْخَمْ الْأَرَثْ HaKarmel لَأَخُولْ Piryah Utuva. That should be familiar from Birkat al-Mihya, right?
Yep.
So you see that the original, it seems therefore to me reasonable. That's the nusach that I say. So I say in the bracha ala michya la'achol mi pirya utuva. The
Yeah.
usual nusach is expanded. It says la'achol mi pirya u'lisbu' mituva. That doesn't say that here. Here it just says la'achol pirya utuva, and I'm sure that the bracha was based on this lashon. Watavo, and they came into the land. Watavo literally means to enter. The word lavo really means to enter. And where does a person enter from the outside? He enters into a house, which is a bayith. So the bayith is where you ba. Ata ba lefocha bayith. So the word lavo means to enter, more than to come. We also use it like in the sense of to come, but come really means to enter. They entered my land and they defiled it with Avodah Zarah. And you turned my inheritance, my land, into a ta'ifa. Harsh words. In other words, the Navi is telling it like it is. He's not. He's not. He's not making it. He's not papering over the facts. Just curious of this book. So I have another book also, Nazir Rashi, but not by a different person. Nothing very different. Sometimes there are differences and what have you, but it's the same in this case. So Uncle Jonathan says, "Wa ilif yafachon, I brought you up la'aradi Israel into Eretz Israel," which is not mentioned in the pasuk explicitly. It says, "Wa'aviyatchem el Eretz HaKarmel." The Targum says, "I brought you to Eretz Israel." The hawaf munthava kecharmela, that was set up and that was built and laid out like a karmela. Let me see if I can give you a more precise translation of munthava. It means planted, laid out, planted. In other words, prepared. You entered the Eretz Yisrael and it was really lush and fertile and cultivated. Maybe cultivated is the best word in our situation. Yeah. So it was cultivated and planted. Kecharmela. The word karmela means basically a very pleasant, rich land area. Doesn't really add anything. So and this land I brought you to was Manuthava Kecharmela, was planted and cultivated like a beautifully cultivated area. Lemechal iba, to eat its fruit, v'tuva, and its goodness, its richness. Wa'altun, and you entered, you came. Arl in Aramaic is to enter. Was sa'ivtun, and you defiled. You made tameh, yaf ara, bet shechinati, the land which is, you defiled the land which is the bet shechinati, the land in which my Shekhinah resides. So sinning in Eretz Yisrael is worse than doing evil, doing averot in Chutz La'aretz is less severe in some ways than doing the very same averot in Eretz Yisrael, because this is Ara Bet Shechinati. The pasuk simply said, "Watavau watatamau eth arsi." You came and defiled my land, but Targum Yonathan adds, the land which is Beth Shechinati, the place, the resting place of my Shekhinah, Wa'ahsanati Shawitun, and my inheritance, my land, you made it into Lefulhan Ta'awatha. You turned it into a place crawling with Avodah Zarah. right? Pulhan, worship. Ta'awatha is idols. Rashi says, Eretz HaKarmel, Rashi says, he brings the Targum of Yonatan, La'arad Yisrael, Dahawath Menusava Kecharbela. Rashi says, Netu'a Kiya'ar. So it's like, just like a forest is very thick, is very thickly forested with trees. In other words, you don't call a forest as a place where there are many trees together. It's a place of much growth. If you have a plain, a savanna with a few trees here and there, you don't call that a forest. You call it savanna or whatever it is, but it's not a forest. Rashi says, Netu'ah, it is richly cultivated and planted, kiyar, like a forest. In other words, wherever you turn, there are fruit-bearing trees, and the fields are bursting with produce. And I brought you into this land, and you defiled it. Okay, perhaps we'll stop here for today.